Salutations, one and all, and welcome to RWBY Revisited. In this installment, let's break down some of the weapons featured in the series and see just how much better or worse they are from one another. I've done a tier list for various powers, so let's do one for weapons too. Please be aware that spoilers for all seasons will follow, and any material revealed or expounded upon in outside sources will not be weighted as heavily as that scene in the show. Now, let me first establish some ground rules. As is the case with weapons in real life, each one is designed for a different purpose. You wouldn't use a longsword for cramped hallways, or you wouldn't bring a grenade launcher to a hostage situation. To that end, I'm going to be evaluating how these weapons would perform in an open combat scenario. This means that while some might be designed as concealed weapons, or have some special use, they will be penalized here. That doesn't mean that they are useless, only that they would not fit this scenario. Secondly, I will not be factoring in any semblances or other gadgets or abilities here. This is about the weapons exclusively. Imagine if a huntsman or huntress without a combat-based semblance were to pick up one of these during a fight. How well would they be on their own? Thirdly, some of the weapons can vary wildly in the strength in which they're depicted, especially with ranged weapons. Sometimes one can be shown as being strong enough to drop a target with only a few hits, while other times it will appear to do little to nothing. I will be factoring these as all being effective in their intended purpose, and I will be examining how effective they would be in performing it. So, let's get on to what these tiers actually mean. At the top of the tier list is S tier. These weapons are the best of the best and are the most effective in the greatest number of scenarios, and don't rely on outside mechanics to function to the best of their abilities. A tier weapons will be quite good, though they might have some drawbacks. Weapons that are designed to have a specific niche will likely fall into this category, as they may be reliant on other allies to keep them safe in scenarios that don't fall into their role. B tier weapons are middle of the road, average. They don't have any phenomenal strengths, but don't have any monumental weaknesses either. C tier weapons may have some applications, but are too limited in what they can accomplish, or have some fault that holds them back that needs to be addressed. F tier weapons, while they may work in the show, only do so because of the rule of cool and would need serious redesigns to be effective. Also, weapons in the same tier are not being quantified as better or worse than each other, so don't place too much on their position within a tier. So, without further ado, let's get on to things. Starting off with the first member of Team RWBY's weapon, Crescent Rose. Looking at Crescent Rose, this weapon stands out a bit from most of the others because of a few factors. For one, it's massive. Weapons in the series tend to be a bit oversized, but Crescent Rose is gigantic. The head alone is about the same size as RWBY herself. Few others are this large, the ones that spring to mind being Crow's Harbinger or Elm's Timber, but another factor that sets it apart is just how many pieces this weapon has. From a visual standpoint, hardly anything comes close to how this weapon can unfurl from its collapsed state into a gargantuan scythe form. While it never happens in the show, if we were to look at this weapon in real life, that many moving parts creates more opportunities for the weapon to malfunction. You see, the more moving parts a machine has, the more components can become worn or jammed with debris. Not to mention that disassembling Crescent Rose and reassembling it during maintenance would take some time indeed. But all that minutia aside, how would it work if you were to try picking it up and swinging it? Well, I've said my piece about scythes before. but I'll reiterate for anyone who isn't aware. You see, swinging a scythe like RWBY does wouldn't result in the blade striking the target. If you were to swing Crescent Rose like you would swing an axe, what would actually make contact with the target will be the blunt frame on top of the scythe. If that was what you wanted, using something like some form of hammer would be better, as it would have a head with increased surface area to make striking easier and more effective. To attack with the blade, RWBY would have to maneuver it around her target and pull back on it, which for one isn't easy to do, as your enemy isn't going to just let you do so, and even if you pulled it off, that wouldn't pack much of a punch. We can even see her try this once while fighting Neo during the battle in the Portal Realm in Season 8. You see, a blade is designed to focus force into a small area. That lets it cut. This sort of pulling motion doesn't have the oomph to do much. Just take a kitchen knife and try pushing the entirety of the blade all at once into something. Not a strike, mind you, just push it. Unless that target is soft, chances are you're going to have to push quite hard, and an enemy isn't just going to allow that to occur. However, Crescent Rose can rotate its blade 90 degrees to become a war scythe. Historically, war scythes were repurposed farming scythes that had their blades rotated 90 degrees so that they could function much like a spear. The cutting edge was not particularly used much. Later, some weapons of this nature would be purpose-crafted war scythes instead of modified farming tools. This would allow it to act as a thrusting weapon, which would be far more effective. Spears were the staple of warfare for centuries, and that's for good reason. It gives you reach and lethality, along with being easy to make. When used in great numbers, they can create a wall of death that will halt enemies in their tracks. This configuration is much better than the standard one, though RWBY doesn't use it nearly as much. Though we do see in some shots that Crescent Rose's blade has numerous nicks and notches, which would make cutting even more difficult. RWBY, I thought you were supposed to love weapons. Why aren't you maintaining yours?
She looked like she had never seen anything quite so horrible in all her life.
Crescent Rose even sports blades on the backside of its head, though these would almost never be able to actually cut anything, due to being behind this bizarre protrusion and pointed inward. More interestingly, Crescent Rose has some small blades and a point on its base, which RWBY has never used as far as I can recall. This would be incredibly useful, allowing both ends of the weapon to be utilized to lethal capacity. Really, weapons like Crescent Rose, Magnhild, and Timber are not used to their full potential. Yes, hitting with the head will do the most outright damage, but striking with the butt or haft will still be able to stun or subdue an enemy. A mod I have for Left 4 Dead 2 that reskins the Fire Axe to be Crescent Rose has this point used in an attack animation. But Crescent Rose is more than just a melee weapon. It can also be used for its integrated sniper rifle. It even has a scope, allowing it to be effective at longer ranges more easily than if it only possessed iron sights. The rounds fired from this weapon are most often portrayed as packing a wallop, dealing significant damage to larger Grim, and even sending human-sized targets flying on impact, such as when RWBY deliberately shot Nora to empower her via lightning dust. Though the firing mechanism of this weapon is somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes it's portrayed as being bolt action, needing to manually eject a spent cartridge after each shot, and other times it seems to be semi-automatic, doing so on its own. This rifle can be rather compact for its power, or even planted into the ground via the scythe's blade to function in a a similar manner to a bipod. This would serve to stabilize the weapon, though it may be difficult to move if the blade gets hooked on something. All in all though, I would place this in B tier. It could use some tweaks, but it's not unusable. Its size is over the top and would make the weapon clunky, and the scythe blade is in an awkward angle most of the time. Next on the team is Weiss's Myrtenaster. This weapon bears a loose resemblance to a rapier, with the guard being evocative of a swept or basket hilt. In earlier seasons, I mistook this weapon for a small sword, as things were not as detailed back then. For reference, a small sword is a type of sword similar to a rapier, though it's shorter, thinner, and sometimes didn't possess an edge at all, used exclusively for thrusting. After the migration to the Maya rendering engine in seasons 4 and onward, I realized my mistake. So this weapon is designed to be used in melee, meant for swift and nimble strikes, though they wouldn't possess the same raw power as something like a longsword or arming sword would have. This is because it lacks the mass of those blades, and after all, force equals mass times velocity. Thanks, science.
Yes, science!
While this would be quite effective against unarmored humanoid opponents in close quarters, against armored opponents or large Grimm with their thick bone-like coatings, this may not be particularly effective. So in CQB, this weapon isn't particularly bad. Armor could shut it down though, which is something to take into account. However, we now encounter a problem. This weapon itself possesses no ranged capabilities, unlike many others. Weiss relies on her semblance, oftentimes enhanced with dust for that, but as I stated in the introduction, semblances will not be factored into this. So this means that if an enemy possesses a ranged weapon, the wielder of Myrtenaster will be at a distinct disadvantage. To add to this, the weapon possesses a mechanism similar to a revolver cylinder integrated into its guard, but someone without the Schnee semblance wouldn't be able to directly make use of its contents. On top of that though, this weapon's grip is attached to the rest of it via a single hinge and locking mechanism. This is a severe structural weakness, as a strong enough force could break it and dismantle the weapon, as all that's holding it together is that hinge. More than that though, it doesn't have a tang because of this. To expound on that, a tang is the part of a sword that extends down from the blade and into the grip and pommel. Without a tang, a blade is simply affixed to the guard, which is a weak point that will often break. Many sword-like objects made today suffer from having no tang or a poorly made one, leading to them breaking. Myrtenaster would run the risk of falling apart under significant strain, which I'm going to have to dock points for, along with it having no ranged capabilities. For that, this weapon sits in C tier. With some adjustments, it could be improved, but it only works for a Schnee. Next up is Blake's weapon, Gambol Shroud. This weapon combines a handgun with a sword. In theory, it's quite interesting. Unfortunately, there are a few things that make my brain start screaming at me when I look at this weapon. The blade curves slightly, possibly inspired by Japanese blades, though they were hardly the only ones across our globe to feature a curved blade. Interestingly, this weapon possesses a second edge along the spine, though it doesn't extend all the way down the weapon's length. This has the potential to be used for cutting, though we haven't seen it used as such. What makes the white noise happen in my brain, however, is how the blade is constructed. It isn't a solid piece, but rather it hinges partway down its length. This creates a structural weakness, and also creates the potential for the edge to fall out of alignment if the hinge is damaged or warped. You see, to cut with an edged weapon, the blade needs to strike perpendicularly to the target. If it hits at an odd angle, it could turn and fail to cut properly. The weapon was damaged in Season 6, but was repaired in the following season, though this was done by simply affixing the broken pieces together in a manner that looks similar to kintsugi, the Japanese technique of repairing pottery with gold. But a sword isn't pottery. Again, edge alignment comes into effect, and if this was off, then the edge will be permanently off kilter. Really, if a blade was broken like Blake's was, then the best method to fix it would be to melt the whole thing down and reforge it. Leaving it like this is likely to just have it break again, as that's a fault line. I know media likes to depict this sort of thing as putting the pieces together like a puzzle, but that just leads to cracks and faults that will just break again later. But the worst part, when the blade is collapsed, it points directly back at the wielder. Oh, I do not like that one bit. Imagine being low on aura or having it broken, only to be caught off guard by an enemy. They could jam it back into you, and then you're in a world of not good. That is an entire barrel of I don't want. A cornucopia of nope. So the blade leaves something to be desired, but what about the rest of Gambol Shroud? Well, the handgun is rather straightforward. Against human-sized targets, this should be sufficient. Larger Grimm, or opponents with strong aura, may be able to shrug it off, however. Handguns, by necessity, will generally have smaller cartridges than something like a rifle, and fewer points of contact with your body, making accuracy a bit more difficult. The scabbard can also serve as a blade, but this is an awkward grip, and the bevel would be off from needing to be wide enough to house the blade, and there's no safe way to carry it, with the edge always being exposed. Gambol Shroud even possesses a cord that Blake can use to increase her mobility. Several weapons will have a similar ability, and so I'll be giving a blanket analysis of this sort of mechanism here. Without something like a hook, these devices wouldn't really be able to latch onto surfaces like they do in the show. As it is, they seem to be almost sentient, wrapping around things at just the right distance of their own accord. That aside, if we are to allow this ability, this would be its greatest asset, and the blade has numerous points where it could fail, and when the handgun is in use, it endangers the user. For that, I give this C tier as well. Back to the drawing board with this one. It could be touched up to be better. The final member of Team RWBY is Yang, and she employs Ember Celica, a pair of shotgun vambraces. Yes, you may have heard that I refer to them as vambraces, not gauntlets. You see, a gauntlet covers the entire hand, and often has individual armored pieces for the fingers, or else covers them all in one piece, sort of like metal oven mitts. Vambraces, sometimes called bracers, only cover the forearms. Yang's weapon fit this much more closely. The strange part about this weapon is that it is the inverse of Weiss's weapon. While hers has no ranged capabilities, Yang's does nothing for melee. Yes, you see, these do nothing to augment her physical attacks. She strikes with her fists. That means that all melee damage she does is with her body. It always sort of annoyed me that Yang can kill Grimm by simply punching them. If you can hit one of them with your fist and kill it, then it makes weapons seem unnecessary for the more standard ones. Setting that aside, what can these do? Well, most commonly seen is that they can release blasts of pellets that spread, dealing damage in more of a cone than a straight line like most firearms. Shotguns are effective at much greater ranges than many people realize, but we haven't seen the upper threshold of what Yang's weapons can reach. So in CQC, these are still quite strong, being able to dish out shotgun blasts as well as protecting Yang's forearms in melee. I do have to question how she fires these, however. There's no visible trigger. She later gets a prosthetic arm to replace the missing one that comes equipped with the same weapon systems, so that may have a neural component. but the other one is unknown. As an aside, it would be amusing if someone had found Yang's other bracer after it was left in Vale with her severed arm and had been using it. Having Adam do so would have been a great opportunity.
What's yours has always been mine.
These can also be equipped with small explosives, which can be planted onto surfaces and gives the weapons a bit more versatility. These are possibly shaped charges, as they were shown to kill a Megalith. Shaped charges are a form of explosive designed to direct the force of the explosion into a target, because otherwise, the force will travel along the path of least resistance, which would be outward and away from what they were planted on. So these are effective, though they do not augment melee outside of an attempt to backhand an opponent with one's arm. So I'm going to slot these into B tier alongside Crescent Rose. A few adjustments could make these a higher tier, though I certainly wouldn't want to strap shotguns to my arms. But Team Juniper is next on the roster, and first up is Crocea Mors. This is a sword and shield, though there is a trend in this show of naming multiple pieces of equipment with one name. I dislike this because it feels like referring to siblings by the same name. They are not one thing, they need separate names. In terms of fantasy swords, this one isn't bad. My only real gripe is that the grip seems to be circular rather than elongated. For a melee weapon with an edge, or any edged tool for that matter, you would want an oblong sort of grip, with the narrower section being aligned with the edge. This lets you know just by feel where your edge is, as well as preventing it from slipping. But other than that, there are no stupid serrations or spikes on this weapon that would ruin the blade geometry, but it would seem as though Jean didn't maintain it properly, as it broke at the end of Season 8. No, I do not accept symbolism as a reason for steel shattering. Jean can also do a strange maneuver when his sword is in its scabbard, as he can extend blades from it. Really, this wouldn't do much besides destroy his capacity to thrust and make the weapon heavier towards the blade end of the weapon, making it a little bit more effective at cleaving. I would like to know how the scabbard doesn't fly off, though. The shield originally is just that, a heater shield. It could do with being just a bit wider, but it's not bad. Oddly enough, there doesn't seem to be anywhere for him to grip the shield, and there are no visible straps securing it to his arm, so I can only assume that it's magnetically attached. This means that it could possibly roll around his arm, which wouldn't be good if under attack. Your arm is cylindrical, after all. Imagine trying to block an attack only for your shield to roll and expose you. The shield did receive some upgrades in Atlas though, allowing it to project hard light from its flanks to extend its area of protection, as well as gravity dust to repulse anything in front of him. Jean has used the former upgrade to both shield his allies as well as function as a glider of sorts, catching enough air to slow his fall. Pushing enemies away gives a nice touch of crowd control, and extending the shield's coverage is a nice touch. But this is still just an arming sword and shield. This means that Jean is limited to exclusively melee, and at distance foe will be beyond his ability to engage. For that, this will go into C tier. Good in melee, but unable to counter an enemy at a distance. Nora is up next, and her weapon is called Magnhild. This weapon functions both as a grenade launcher and warhammer. In its melee form, it is quite large. Not as big as Crescent Rose, but still sizable. Given that it's made entirely of metal, this would make it rather heavy, and thus slower and more difficult to swing. The grip is also entirely made of metal, and has several hinges along its length. I've said before, hinges are a weak point. They could break, leading to the weapon losing its ability to lock into a configuration. A solid metal handle would also be difficult to grasp if it gets wet. I would rather have a wooden or leather wrapped grip, but things like a rubberized or even bone grip could work too. But if one could get this thing moving, it would certainly pack a punch. Most people would describe this weapon as a maul, but I would debate that point. Mauls do not typically feature a spike like a warhammer does, but the back of the head of this weapon tapers. While this isn't a true spike, this would focus the force of a strike into a smaller area in a manner similar to one. While we haven't seen Nora do so, in theory, she could flip this weapon around to try piercing armor, like the ivory carapace that some Grimm have. This weapon's ranged mode is that of a grenade launcher. Now, the power behind these has varied wildly, but let's assume that it is comparable to the grenade launchers that we possess. This would make it quite powerful, dealing impressive damage in the area of effect. This would make it effective against lightly armored vehicles and Grimm, along with being devastating to human-sized targets. However, this power comes at a cost. Magnhild lacks the ability to engage multiple targets quickly at close to medium range like a rifle or submachine gun would. You see, it fires explosives. Many modern grenade launchers require the round to rotate a certain number of times before it arms, thus they cannot be used at close range, and even if that wasn't the case, you don't want to set off an explosive too close to yourself. Additionally, it can be used as a mobility device, being self-propelled by some means. How Nora pilots this is unknown, but she seems to be able to steer it along with taking off and landing. This weapon means that Nora would be serving a support role, relying on her allies to deal with targets that she cannot properly engage. So, I would place this weapon in A tier. It requires the support of teammates and has too many hinges, but it is powerful. Pyrrha was the third member of Team Juniper, and she wielded Milo and Akuo. I hope I'm pronouncing those correctly. And thankfully, she had the decency to give her weapon and shield each a name. While Milo was a weapon that could configure into a sword resembling a Xiphos of ancient Greece, extend to become a spear, or even become a rifle. This gives a massive amount of flexibility to the user. Are you in cramped quarters? Use the sword. Are you in melee in an open area? Use the spear. Do you need to engage a foe with a ranged weapon? You've got a rifle. All in one. Historically, it was common for warriors across the world to carry multiple weapons on their person, such as how a samurai would carry a wakizashi short sword and perhaps even a tanto dagger if he was to enter a building, where he couldn't properly use larger weapons due to the structural confines. This weapon eliminates the need to carry more than one. It covers all of that, and in addition, it comes with a shield. Its design is also based on that seen in ancient Greece, called a dipylon or sometimes a Boeotian shield. These sorts of shields weren't completely round, like the Aspis shield. Rather, they were more oval in nature with indentations along the sides to allow the user to thrust with sword or spear while maintaining their guard with the shield, rather than having to reach around it. This would help even more in melee, allowing the wielder to defend themselves while striking at the same time. Now, shields were more common in open battlefields rather than duels, as it is possible for a single opponent to either outmaneuver it or grab onto its rim and twist. That would either wrench the holder's arm if it's strapped to them, or force them to drop it. Still, it's not a deal breaker by any means, as that's not easy to do. All in all, I would slot this into S tier. This weapon is extremely versatile, and you get a shield as a bonus. Now we come to Stormflower, Ren's machine pistols. These are handguns capable of fully automatic fire. Automatic pistols generally aren't issued to militaries, as an automatic rifle has more points of contact with your body, allowing you to maintain control more easily. This would take some practice, but it can certainly be done. Now, dual-wielding firearms is different from dual-wielding melee weapons, given that if you're trying to aim, you cannot simultaneously do so with both at once. At close range, this might not be an issue, but at longer ranges, you would need to aim one at a time, unless perhaps you were a chameleon faunus who could utilize each eye independently. That would be something to see. These weapons also have an attached pair of bayonets, though they point downwards instead of forward. This doesn't help as much as they otherwise would, as they don't give much reach, and trying to slash with the blades would be awkward, akin to a reverse grip, which requires a greater range of motion than one would need with a normal grip. The downward angle of the blades is also concerning, as people end up stabbing themselves more frequently than you would think by holding knives in a reverse grip. These blades are also telescopic, retracting into themselves for storage, but this would weaken the structural integrity of them. Hollow sections are not good for melee weapons. These weapons also sport grappling devices. This seldom helps Ren out in combat, as he uses it in an incredibly telegraphed manner, but it is useful for mobility. If one could ensnare an enemy's limb in close quarters though, then this could be quite useful. I'd place this in B tier. The rounds from this weapon have been inconsistently portrayed in what they can do, but assuming it's as effective as our handguns, then these are decent. Rotate the bayonets, and I would rate them higher. Given that there are two, you could even give one to an ally who's been disarmed. Moving on, let's take a look at the weapons of some other prominent characters. Crow wields Harbinger, and this weapon, on first glance, appears to be a scythe like RWBY's Crescent Rose, but take a look at where the edge is. The blade is on the outside of the weapon's curve. This means that it will strike the target, unlike with Crescent Rose. This would make it function similarly to an axe rather than a scythe. A stylized one to be sure, but it is similar. Axes have been a common sight in war throughout our species' history, so while this is a bit on the big side, this is a good setup.
And that's where the blade curves.
Additionally, it can retract its components to form a longsword, though given the proportions, a blade this wide would be extremely heavy, though Crow can oddly use this weapon with one hand. Additionally, this also has a war scythe configuration, which would be great for added reach. This weapon houses a pair of gun barrels, which seem to be able to fire either standard shotgun pellets or slugs, as Crow has been shown to fire single projectiles as well as a spread. I'm not sure where the magazine would be inserted into this weapon, but it must have one somewhere. This shotgun is capable of functioning regardless of which configuration the weapon is in, as Crow can fire it even when it is between one of its three setups. So while not the prettiest weapon, this one is certainly capable of functioning in a variety of scenarios. So to that end, I will be placing it in A tier. It's got some advantages over Crescent Rose, but it is still a little awkward in its proportions. Still, it's definitely on the better designed end of this spectrum. Crow's sister Raven wields a weapon called Omen. This weapon consists of a sword hilt that Raven can attach blades made of various types of dust to. This can allow her to use various elemental effects, which wouldn't generally be accessible to a normal steel blade. This has drawbacks, however. The dust blades are not as durable as iron or steel, and seem to eventually break, and thus Raven carries a scabbard that contains numerous blades that she can equip. The dust does give her some ranged capabilities, but I would not say that these can outright replace a firearm, as they cannot release this energy as quickly as a gun can, and they are slower projectiles than a bullet. It's also unknown how much these dust blades weigh. If they're lighter than steel, the weapon would be more nimble, but could be batted aside by larger weapons. But given that they can break mid-combat, this would mean that the wielder would be disarmed until they manage to equip a new one, and that leaves you in a dangerous situation where your opponent can rush you while you're defenseless. This scabbard would also be essential because of this, and it could be quite cumbersome with all of those blades, which can be various lengths. You'd likely need to take your eyes off your enemy to make sure you're equipping the correct blade as well. It's an interesting weapon, but more gimmicky than truly effective. The brittle blades and the need to re-equip them is a major drawback, and so I will be placing this in C tier. It's definitely not useless, but it needs to be more reliable than it is. But on the evil side of things, let's look at Cinder's crew. Mercury's prosthetic legs come equipped with some sort of ranged weapon, allowing him to fire them as he kicks, though what sort of mechanism allows for this is unknown. I imagine you wouldn't want them to go off just because you were walking down some stairs. But the real question is how Mercury aims these weapons. Kicking an enemy in melee is a far cry from attempting to fire a weapon attached to your foot to hit a target at range. There are no sights to look down, and kicking isn't exactly conducive to accuracy beyond the distance of your leg. Stranger still, Mercury once seemed to be able to create a massive vortex of dust rounds that orbited Yang before striking her all at once. What mechanism allowed for that? Is he telekinetic? Because that's about the only thing that could have allowed for that. In addition, kicking, while having more power than hand techniques most of the time, requires more energy. Mercury somewhat counteracts this by having prosthetic legs, but those don't replace his entire leg. Each attack will be using stamina, which isn't the case for a firearm. You would also need enough room to kick, which isn't always available. And this is all topped off by the fact that these do not augment melee abilities beyond their nature of being prosthetics. This is the first weapon to go into F tier. Without a way to aim and requiring you to kick, this would be difficult to use at best. Cinder's other henchman is Emerald, and she wields Thief's Respite. Really? That's the name you're going with. Personally, I believe that if you're going to name a weapon, it should be something that inspires your allies, intimidates your enemies, or at least is some sort of principle or value you draw strength from. These names just leave me scratching my head. These weapons are extremely similar to Ren's, right down to being green. They aren't completely identical though. First off, these blades can point forward rather than down. The exact angle seems to be able to vary, but this allows for increased reach, which would be a direct upgrade in melee. Ren's weapons give him next to no reach advantage beyond the length of his arm.
I do not doubt his heart. The reach of his arm.
Second, these weapons, while still being rather compact, are slightly larger. Theoretically, this could allow for some better rifling, allowing the projectiles to be more accurate. Finally, instead of cords, these weapons have actual chains, which would be much more difficult to damage. Though both these and Stormflower have an issue that they couldn't possibly house this amount of line, but we'll ignore that. So all in all, these are a direct upgrade to Stormflower, and so I will slot these into A tier. They are very similar, but mitigate some of the previous weapons' shortcomings. Now, let's move on from Cinder's goons to the forces of Atlas. We'll start off with the Aesops, sans Vine, as he almost never used his weapon, so with a lack of data, I will be omitting it. Harriet used a system referred to as Fast Knuckles, external mechanized devices to grant her additional force in her arms. These definitely have viable applications, but are held back by a few factors. While they may increase the force of her melee strikes, as well as granting her increased strength to lift heavy objects, they do not have any ranged capabilities. Harriet relies on getting close to a target via her semblance equivalents for that. This would require her to be able to close that distance, and wouldn't be an option at all for someone else using this system. Next, they can unfurl from their mount on her shoulders, where they're stored when not in use. However, that comes back to the number of moving parts problem, meaning that they could wear down or be damaged. This would be best used as a supplementary piece of kit, rather than a primary weapon. For that, I will place this in C tier. It has applications, but has too many shortcomings to be an effective primary weapon. Marrow used a weapon called Fetch. This weapon can function as a rifle and a boomerang. Rifles have been proven effective over the course of human history, and are the mainstay of armed forces across the globe. This aspect of his weapon is not what I will call into question. It's the other configuration that I begin to doubt with this weapon. Marrow can throw it, and it will return to him, but the problem with that is that it deprives the wielder of their weapon. If it could be knocked out of the air or caught, then the user will have successfully disarmed themselves. Thrown weapons only work when you have another weapon to use. When it's your only weapon, you're setting yourself up for failure.
That is a wonderful trick. Except once again, you are between me and my way out. And now, you have no weapon.
This weapon can also be used as a sword, but this grip doesn't look to be particularly ergonomic, as shown here, where Marrow attempts to use it with two hands, but doesn't have enough space on the grip to do so. Still, with it serving as a functional rifle, I will slot this into A tier. The other configuration can be largely ignored, though it could be adjusted to earn this weapon a higher tier. Elm wields Timber, a weapon that functioned as both a hammer and a rocket launcher. This makes it very similar to Nora's Magnhild, but not entirely the same. While grenade launchers are typically applied for anti-infantry or against light armor, rocket launchers are more useful against heavier targets. Grenade launchers also have an arc, meaning that hypothetically, one could mortar the projectile down onto an area without a line of sight. Rockets fly in a more or less direct line, meaning that they require a line of sight. Missiles have guidance systems to hit targets indirectly, whereas rockets do not.
If I had a rocket launcher, if I had a rocket launcher.
Strangely, Timber is depicted as having significant recoil, while real-life rocket launchers often reduce this by having backblast, where the back of the weapon is open and expels the initial explosive force of the rocket's launch directly behind the user, which also means that one cannot stand behind an ally wielding a rocket launcher. Even so, this weapon was shown to outright destroy Large Grim, something many others struggled with. Many of the other aspects of Magnhild apply to this weapon as well, so this one will also go into A tier. It would require the wielder to be assisted by allies, however, as rocket launchers are highly situational. Clover was the leader of the Aesops, and he wielded Kingfisher. I'm going to be upfront about this one. This is not a good weapon. It's just a fishing rod. That head doesn't have the mass to do any real damage like a flail would, and that hook isn't large enough to function as anything other than a torture device, so it cannot deal any noticeable melee damage, but it also has no ranged capabilities. All it can do is ensnare an opponent. That isn't guaranteed to stop them from attacking you, especially if they have more than one weapon. So this weapon goes into F tier. I hesitate to even call this a weapon. It's more of a restraining implement. You might say that it could be used with allies who have other weapons, but then why not have a real weapon yourself and simply deal with the problem? Winter took over Clover's role after his death, and she has an unnamed saber and a matching dagger. This setup is heavily reminiscent of dueling in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, where a single-handed sword, like a rapier or small sword, would be used in conjunction with a parrying dagger. This was an extremely effective setup for a one-on-one encounter with lightly or unarmored opponents, but I dislike how the dagger is stored within the sword. This leaves the sword's hilt as a hollow shell, which is a structural weakness, along with leaving the center of the blade as empty space, which could also weaken it. Still, having a setup like this would allow Winter to deflect an enemy's weapon with one of hers, typically the dagger, and simultaneously strike with her other weapon. This was effective in our own history for quite some time. However, these weapons also have no ability to engage from range. While I certainly love my melee weapons, modern tech, and by extension Remnant's tech, allows for ranged weapons to have the advantage most of the time. This will knock these weapons down to C tier. Very effective in their niche, but they'll be outranged by firearms. Remember that semblances are not being factored into this video. Ironwood was at the head of it all in Atlas, and he wielded a pair of revolvers called Due Process. Now, while these are simply a pair of handguns, with no special gimmicks to them, they are shown as being significantly more powerful than others of similar dimensions. He was able to launch himself with these, something only larger weapons are normally capable of doing. Ren certainly can't do this with his weapons. Given that he carries two of these, this will ensure that even if something should happen to one, he can still use the other. While these do not augment melee in any capacity, handguns are less effective at longer ranges, as accuracy is more difficult. To this end, I will be giving these A tier. Ironwood later decided to swap these out for a cannon late in Season 8, with these pistols serving as a trigger mechanism for it. I will be calling this unnamed weapon a plasma cannon, as that is what it appears to function as. Some will say that this is a laser, but it does not function like one, aside from one instance where Winter was able to reflect its blast back at Ironwood. Lasers are a beam of light that obviously travels at the speed of light and requires sustained contact with their target to do damage. This is not what this cannon does. It fires a blast that has travel time and deals damage in an area on contact. That's plasma, not a laser. Unfortunately, this weapon would be better suited as one weapon of several on a vehicle or as a mounted weapon emplacement, as it takes time to charge up and appears to be quite heavy and awkward to handle. This charge up time would be extremely detrimental. If you're going to fire a weapon, you need that damage now, not later. That will give an opponent the chance to get to cover or rush you, or even put you down before your weapon can fire. This belongs in C tier. It has applications, but those would be on a vehicle or a weapon emplacement, not as an infantry weapon. Penny had an unorthodox weapon called the Floating Array. This was a series of swords that were connected to her back via strings that seemed to possess some form of guidance, as they could be directed to move at her command as she willed. I believe that these cords would get tangled with each other, however. I mean, think about it. If you have headphones or charging cords, put them in a drawer one at a time. Go to reach for one later though, and they're somehow tangled. Now imagine these swords swinging every which way. This would also put these blades at the end of a flexible cord. A flexible weapon like a flail works because it's blunt. You don't need to worry about which way it hits. As I mentioned with Blake's weapon, edge alignment matters a great deal, and these might glance off their target. Penny could also project energy beams, but it's difficult to say whether this is part of her or her weapon. I'm going to say, for the purposes of this video, that the blades and energy beams are a part of the backpack that houses them, so I will assume that it could be used as well. This beam was shown to be quite strong, and would be much more effective than the swords in most cases. They could slice through most Grim with ease, and even give some of the giant ones pause. For that, this belongs in B tier. The beams are effective, but I would rather just have a single sword or two. Moving on to some of the less seen weapons, we have the weapon used by Coco, Gianduja, Gianduja, Gianduja. Wow, that's a mouthful. There's no reason for that to be a needless scramble of letters. So this weapon is a minigun that can become a bag. It's shown to be powerful, but it has been stated that Coco amplifies dust. That includes ammunition. So it's difficult to say how much of that power is from the weapon itself and how much comes from Coco. Even if we attribute all the power to the weapon, the main problem is that it will burn through its ammunition in moments. Miniguns have an absurd rate of fire, which necessitates them being mounted onto vehicles, which can carry enough ammo to make them viable. For infantry, you just won't be able to carry enough ammunition to justify its use. Its other form is a bag, which is not an effective weapon. Sure, it may be heavy, but it's not designed in a way to be conducive to swinging effectively, especially against multiple opponents. For these reasons, I will place it in B tier. It's effective, but it does have some drawbacks that prevent it from being any higher than this. We did see 2 weapons from Beacon's staff, and so we'll be looking at Professor Oobleck's weapon, Antiquity's Roast. This weapon is shown to function as a flamethrower, a club of sorts, and even a thermos. Now, the flamethrower doesn't behave in a manner akin to those we've used. Rather than projecting a stream of ignitable liquid, this weapon shoots fireballs. While this is an impressive display, there are 2 issues with this. 1, the fire isn't something you can contain once you've unleashed it. As long as it has something to burn, it will spread, which is not good when you're fighting in many environments. You don't want to burn down a city block or start a forest fire. Second, fire is not a way to put down an enemy instantly. Someone who has been set on fire can still take action, which, if you're fighting them in the first place, you don't want them to do. Imagine setting an opponent alight, only for them to rush you and set you on fire too. This isn't entirely without application though, and so I'll be placing it in C tier. This is a situational weapon, one that should be inside an armory until required.
Mac wants the flamethrower. Mac wants the what? That's what he said, now move!
The other weapon from Beacon's staff is Blowhard, used by Professor Port. Scholagrim, of all people, did a video on this a while back, which I would recommend watching, as I will be referencing his points. Blowhard is a blunderbuss that functions as a double-bit axe. The problem here is that there's an axe blade where you would need to put your face to aim, meaning that Port can only blind fire this weapon. It's also difficult or even impossible to shoulder it properly. And this is setting aside that there are much better shotgun varieties available to begin with, so I will be placing this in F tier. Cool as a display piece, but that's about it. Sun uses a pair of nunchucks named Ruyi Bang and Jingu Bang, which can also function as shotguns. I've said it before, but nunchucks are a poor man's flail. They have less mass, and nothing prevents them from rolling once they strike their target, meaning that the force behind them won't all be transferred into the enemy. The spikes on a flail are not meant to penetrate an enemy. They are meant to prevent the head from rolling once it makes contact. If you had a smooth ball, it would not transfer all of the force of the impact.
Oh, A fellow chucker, eh?
To their credit, these can be locked together to form a staff that, while not capable of dealing lethal damage in one strike, is a more viable option that can block or parry an enemy's blows, as well as deal some damage, though it would not stack up against larger Grimm. The shotgun aspect would be the strongest part of these weapons, though given how small they are, I'm uncertain as to how much oomph they have behind them. So I'll be placing these in C tier. The shotguns could be useful, but these need some adjustments to be more than a nuisance in melee. Anesidora was the weapon used by Velvet, and it functioned as a camera that could replicate the weapons it took pictures of via hard-like dust. This is an interesting piece of kit, but Coco stated before that hard light dust is either difficult to make or expensive to purchase, as she held Velvet back from the fight at the end of Season 2 to prevent her from using up her supply. Velvet uses this in conjunction with her semblance to mimic physical feats that she's witnessed, but we are not factoring in semblances. This weapon first requires the user to have a stockpile of both hard light dust and pictures of weapons, which will take time to acquire. Not only that, but the weapons generated by this dust will break after a few hits, meaning that the wielder will need to re-engage it, thus using their limited supply of dust rather quickly. For that, I will place it in C tier. It's not useless, but it has quite a few drawbacks. Flint Cole used a bizarre weapon. It was a trumpet that emitted some sort of energy. I'm going to assume that this was dust of some sort, as otherwise it makes little to no sense. Perhaps it was some kind of sonic amplifier. Regardless, this lacks the ability to down a target immediately and requires the user to blow into it, which will become difficult if you're winded from exertion. The scene with him and Neon Cat being deployed alongside the Atlas military made me laugh. Can you imagine being sent into a combat zone and someone in your squad, whom you're supposed to trust to have your back, is armed with a trumpet? My morale would be gone.
The music's bad and you should feel bad.
This goes into F tier. Simple as. In last month's video, I looked at Maria's fight against Talk's group, and I did address her weapons there. To recap, however, she wields a pair of kama named Life and Death, though unfortunately, the tips point downwards, so they cannot pierce a target when she swings at them. She'll just deal a bit of blunt force trauma instead. The blades on the back will also never impact a target, so their existence is moot. They can fire projectiles though, so that's a plus. She's not limited to exclusively melee like some others. These can also join together to form a staff-like weapon, though they oddly orbit her like some sort of magical effect. They are linked via gravity dust, which can be strong enough to pull the wielder to one if it is somewhere else, or be used to retrieve a lost weapon. I would put these in B tier, flip the point so that it faces the enemy, and I would move it into a higher tier. Neo utilized a weapon called Hush, which was an umbrella with a concealed blade. As I said at the start of this video, we will be analyzing these weapons in an open combat scenario. While this weapon would be perfect for assassination, it lacks the ability to engage at range. The blade is also rather long and thin, which could leave her open if an enemy parries a strike and closes in. This has been shown to be able to block bullets with the umbrella, though the strength of ranged weapons makes this rather inconsistent. It somehow even blocked a grenade from Nora, which is entirely nonsensical, as even if it was strong enough to stop the projectile, which it shouldn't be, the resulting concussive force should have at least stunned Neo for some time. This sits in F tier. In open combat, it will be difficult to use properly, and most characters that fight Neo seem to turn their brains off a bit when when fighting her, giving her success that she really shouldn't have had. Roman Torchwick's weapon, Melodic Cudgel, is a little better, though this also is primarily a concealed weapon. It is a cane that doubles as a firearm. A cane isn't a great melee weapon, as it lacks the ability to do enough damage in a single hit to end a fight. However, Roman can engage at range, unlike Neo, so I will be placing this weapon one tier up in C. It can bite back, but I would rather have a dedicated combat weapon rather than a concealed weapon. Tyrion Kalos had a pair of Qatar-like weapons called the Queen's Servants, and much of what I say here will also apply to Vernal's weapons, as the two are remarkably similar. These blades extend from the wrist, though they only reach to about Tyrion's fingertips, and thus do not provide him with any reach advantage. Where these are positioned, they will typically be used for slashing, as they do not extend far, and thus would be difficult to thrust with. They do possess ranged capabilities though, but this requires Tyrion to point his entire arm at the target, rather than just shifting his body slightly like a normal rifle, submachine gun, or the like would require. These are simple weapons, but not terrible. I will be slotting these into B tier. Adam Taurus used a sword whose scabbard also functioned as a firearm, called Wilt and Blush. That's the name you went with? What is this, a makeup brand? What kind of a name is that?
Right. What the hell kind of name is
Wilt and Blush?
How'd a muppet like you pass selection?
Without Adam's semblance, his sword is just that. A sword. Effective in melee, so it earns points there. And what is this I see? It has an oblong grip. Something that I wish Jean's sword possessed. Points awarded there. The length of this weapon makes it resemble that of a hand-and-a-half sword, one equally usable with either one or two hands, making it quite versatile. I'm uncertain as to what type of weapon the scabbard is supposed to be, however. Adam exclusively uses this weapon at short range, indicating that it may have significant spread, or that its rounds are not powerful enough to strike distant targets. Its compact frame would also make distance shots more difficult. Still, it's a rather solid setup, so I will be putting it in B tier. It might struggle at longer ranges, but it's definitely not the worst we've seen here. Robin wielded an unnamed crossbow type weapon that was attached to her wrist. This made it compact and easy to carry, but it suffers in other ways because of this. Its bolts are rather slow, and this is likely because of the small limbs of the weapon. Bows and crossbows derive their power from the limbs bending and snapping back into position, not the elasticity of the string. This means that it will be much more difficult for these shorter limbs to generate power, and Tyrion toyed with her during their confrontation because of this. The bolts can explode, giving it some more viability though. This can also unfurl into a short-bladed weapon, something that seems to be a hybrid between a buckler shield and a melee weapon. This doesn't provide much reach though. This weapon tries to be several things, but is only mildly effective in any aspect, so I will place it in C tier. It needs to be adjusted to commit to one role. A unique weapon was wielded by Ilya, and it was dubbed Lightning Lash. This was a blade that seems like it would be best suited for dueling, as it tapers towards the base, leading towards having most of the weight be close to the hand, with the tip being rather thin. This would allow for it to be nimble, but not have much heft. This weapon's blade is also divided into segments which can separate, while still being attached to a flexible core, allowing it to function like a whip, reminiscent of the Indian Urumi sword. That weapon was certainly creative, but not particularly effective. Edge alignment is extremely difficult to achieve, and there would be little to no power behind those strikes. These sections, as they're not a solid piece, are also each subject to damage, which could cause the entire weapon to fall apart. Lightning Lash can also be electrified through dust, though this doesn't seem to be able to produce lethal amounts of output. That could be useful for stunning an enemy though, as it could function as a taser, which would disrupt the electrical signals from the opponent's brain to their limbs. It even has the ability to fire projectiles, though this has been seen far less frequently, so the exact output of damage it can deal is undefined. I originally thought I would place this weapon much lower than I did, but I'm going to place it in B tier. While I would rather have the blade be a single piece, this isn't bad, as it is a functional sword and can also grant its user electrical-based attacks and boasts ranged abilities. It turned out to be better than I remembered. To conclude things, we will end with Ozma's weapon, the Long Memory. Unfortunately, this is just a cane. It doesn't have the density that a blunt weapon will require, no blade to inflict cuts with, and no tip to pierce a target. All it can do is deliver some painful, but not particularly damaging strikes, and collapse in on itself due to its telescopic nature. Now, you might cite that it has magical abilities, but we've never seen anyone other than someone Ozma is sharing a body with do so. As such, there is little to no reason to believe that any random person can use this magic. If they could, then this weapon is a massive liability for Ozma, as if he lost it, someone could do incredible damage. Ozma doesn't seem to be particularly concerned with that though, so I do not believe that it can be accessed by just anyone. So I will place this in F tier. It's just a cane. And this concludes the weapons tier list. I hope that I provided sufficient reasoning for each weapon's placement. Many are creative, but creativity doesn't equate to effectiveness. But what do you think about this? Am I in the right, or am I full of it? What are some of your favorite or least favorite weapons in the series? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a like on this video if you're so inclined, and subscribe to see more. I would like to thank you for watching, and may you all have a weapon in each hand.